happy to be joined today for this webinar by Lindsay Christopher, Claudia Hurtado-Myers, and Stevie Gray. And I'm going to turn it over to them and let the three of them introduce themselves a little bit more and talk about the programs and how they're involved in this.
Thanks, Jen. This is Stevie. I am the Housing Program Manager at the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And so I do a lot of training and technical assistance. I work a lot on the Housing for Crime Victims Special Project, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, around for kind of training and technical assistance questions as they relate to housing and domestic violence. So I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit more about housing with you all, and I'll let Lindsay and Claudia introduce themselves. We'll start with Lindsay.
I am Lindsay Christopher. I'm the Housing Stability for Survivors Project Coordinator at Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence. So I am part of our housing team. We're a new team that with some of our grant funds, we were able to start a housing team here at SPAN last year. So I'm one of 5 folks on the housing team, and I provide support to our advocates that do direct client case management. So I do a lot of outreach with landlords, supporting clients, and then some of our program logistics as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Hurtado-Myers. I am the Housing Manager at Bright Future Foundation in Eagle County. As far as we don't quite have as large of a team, it's just me doing the special project, but we do have a shelter coordinator, and we also have a rapid rehousing program. So I guess it would be 3 of us.
All right, great. Thank you all. We can go to the next slide. And this is Stevie again. And just to give you an idea of sort of what we wanted to chat with you all about today, I'm going to give a very brief overview of some common housing protections, both federal and state. And then I'll give an overview of the Housing for Crime Victims Special Project, which focuses on long-term housing. And then Lindsay will talk a little bit specifically about how their program works at SPAN. And then Claudia will do the same for Bright Futures. And then we'll leave some time for discussion and questions. But as Jen said earlier, feel free to type those questions in throughout, and we're happy to answer those as we go. And kind of moving to the next slide, we wanted to give you a little brief highlight of some housing protections, because I'm sure many of you have come across situations where maybe what a survivor needs is just the ability to stay where they're at or get out of a lease. And so these are some of the things that you may come across. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of protections, but just to give you sort of an overview, and then also let me know, I'm an ongoing resource as these things come up if you have additional questions. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, which is a federal legislation. And there are a few housing protections within VOCA. A lot of them came with the 2013 reauthorization. And so when we're talking about these protections, we're talking specifically about federally funded housing programs. So these aren't things that are going to apply to the smaller landlords per se, but really thinking about funding that comes from housing and urban development. And if you do want an exhaustive list, reach out to me offline and I'm happy to send that to you. But when we're thinking about this, it's mainly public housing authorities, folks who are getting HUD vouchers, housing choice or Section 8, things like that. But under the Violence Against Women Act, a landlord covered by one of these programs cannot terminate a lease, refuse to rent to someone, or evict someone just because they're a survivor. There's some pretty strong protections there. If a survivor is breaking some lease violations or other things, they can evict them on that, but not because they're a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. The other really great thing that happened with the last reauthorization of VAWA is that they extended what the definition of sexual assault means, so that it really includes any non-consensual non-consensual sexual act, including when a victim lacks capacity to consent. That was able to be expanded. If you can go to the next slide. And one thing I want you to keep in mind, like I said, a lot of these through VAWA were more recent, and so it's taken some time for folks to kind of catch up and get these things implemented. And so one of the things they were required to do is to adopt emergency transfer policies, meaning that if a survivor, say, has a housing choice or Section 8 voucher, that if they feel that they're in danger and they need to move, that the housing authority needs to have a plan to get them to a new unit so that they can keep their voucher without losing that just because they're in danger. So there is a process in terms of what this can look like, but that VAWA really asked them to make sure that there is a plan in place so that survivors have the ability to transfer. This can be a challenge if, say, they're in an actual unit that's specified under that program, so it's not necessarily a transferable voucher, but those are still covered as well. There's not necessarily a strict time frame, which can also be a challenge, but they do have to continue to adapt these, and it is something that should be in place. And again, if you want additional information on sort of what has to all be included, let me know. And a survivor of sexual assault can request a transfer within 90 days if the assault happened on the premises. All right, next slide. Okay, so that's just a brief snapshot of federal, but there's additional materials I'm happy to send out if you want to get in the weeds with that a little more. On a state level, we do have a housing law that protects survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. We've had a law in the books for a few years that was specific to domestic violence, and last legislative session, that law was expanded to include sexual assault and stalking, which is great. So under this law, survivors, when we're talking about this one in the state law, this would apply to landlords in general, so not just these federal funded housing programs that I was talking about under VAWA. So this would be, the more general landlord in Colorado. And so under this law, a survivor can break their lease early if they feel that they're in danger and need to move. They are still required under this to pay an additional month's rent if they move, but that they can get out early. And there are certain things that they need in order to, quote unquote, prove that they are a survivor. And it used to be that they could only use a police report or a protection order. But with the latest expansion of the law, they can now use a letter from an address confidentiality application assistant or a medical professional. So they don't have to have the protection order or police report. They can have one of these other forms of verification along with a letter that sort of states that they feel that they're in danger and need to vacate the premises. All right, next slide. And this law, on top of allowing them to break a lease, it also protects them from wrongful eviction, that they can't be evicted just because they're a victim. But similar to VAWA, they can evict them if they have if they've broken other violations of their lease. And the other really good part about this legislation that not a lot of states have is that survivors cannot be penalized for making emergency assistance calls, or what they call nuisance. This has a nuisance protection. So it doesn't matter if they're calling the police and the police are responding. That's what they need to do often to keep themselves safe. That can't be a reason to evict someone. I do have some resources that kind of go into the specifics of sort of what folks need to get out of their lease, what these protections are. And sometimes what we're seeing, and you may already be seeing, is that landlords may not know about this, may not understand the types of verification that someone can have. And so I'm happy to provide some resources, and I would encourage you to reach out to the legal services that you might use. Sometimes it just helps to have a letter from an attorney where they can apply the law specifically to a case. So Rocky Mountain Victim Law Center, organizations like that can maybe help a survivor if a landlord is being resistant or not allowing them out of their lease. But making sure, one other thing I'll say is we want to make sure that a letter and these verification is provided before a survivor vacates the premises, because if they've already left or been evicted, there's nothing necessarily in place to apply this retroactively. So that can be a challenge. But again, additional resources on all of this as you need them. I know that's a very quick overview, but just keeping these things in the back of your mind as you're working with folks, because sometimes this may make all the difference so they don't end up with an eviction on their record, which can in turn make it more difficult to get into housing. So we have some protections on the federal level and in public housing as well as on the state level. All right, we can go to the next slide. I apologize, I'm all stuffed up, my allergies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our Housing for Crime Victims special project, which some of you may have heard about, and then turning it over to Lindsay and Claudia after that to kind of go into more of the specifics. We can go to the next slide. So just to give you a little bit of background, how this kind of came to be, when we got an additional influx of VOCA funds on a state level, the Division of Criminal Justice did a statewide needs assessment, and they wanted to know what are some of the gaps that maybe we're not meeting or that we need to use additional resources for. And not surprisingly, housing was one of the top three. And so DCJ worked closely with us at DCADV, other stakeholders like DVP and the Attorney General's office and several others who came together to figure out what a project might look like and how to put together a process to try to figure out how do we meet this need better in our community, specifically around long-term housing, using other evidence-based approaches. And so if you'll go to the next slide, and this will help me explain it a little bit better. But what we did is looked at, what are some approaches that other states have used that we know work, that are based in evidence. And so we really modeled it after the domestic violence housing first approach, which started in Washington state. And we wanted to leave it more flexible enough that knowing how different all communities are across the state and across the country, how could we, have these core components that are part of domestic violence housing first and make them flexible enough that our communities could sort of play around with them a little bit, that we could test this out, so to say, and figure out how it would work for us. And so we had the stakeholders, some housing experts, and a variety of folks come together and put together an application and a process, a request for proposals process. And then we selected 8 sites to sort of be our pilot sites on this project, help us gather information. So you can see on this map, this is where the 8 sites ended up being. And for the most part, our sites are in rural areas, which was important to us as well, to have a variety of places in the state that could try this out. And so, as you can see on the right-hand side of the page, the core components that we really asked our sites to focus on was survivor-driven mobile advocacy. So that means literally going to where survivors are at in the community, where they feel safe, but also that sort of takes down some of those barriers. So that could be meeting with them at a coffee shop or McDonald's. It could be meeting with them in their home, if that's an option. So really bringing services into community. And Lindsay and Claudia, kind of merge their names there, we'll talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure, and how that looks on the ground. Another important part of the project was really working with the community, so working with housing partners, attending meetings, engaging landlords, so really trying to partner across sectors to meet this need, because we're really talking about housing folks in the community with the infrastructure that's already there or not there. So not necessarily building housing or having your own units, but really trying to partner with those in the community to get survivors housed where they need to be and want to be. which often is with, landlord engagement, but also with housing and homelessness partners and other partners to try to figure out how to fill some of these gaps. All the projects providing some sort of housing assistance or financial assistance. Not everyone necessarily needs financial, but most often under this project, the types of things they're helping with are rental assistance, which is the most common, but also things like utilities, sometimes childcare, transportation, relocation. So really trying to figure out, and within that survivor-driven model, what is it that this survivor and this family needs that's going to help them stay housed long-term or get housed. That's really our focus, is the housing piece. And falling under the housing first model is, how do we get someone housed and then provide the supports they need to stay housed? And that looks different for everybody. So really trying to keep it within a low barrier approach, meaning that we don't have a laundry list of requirements that they have to follow. They don't have to have a certain number of kids. They don't have to have a certain income, that we really try to be flexible. And every program has adapted this, right, to fit their budget and different needs, but really trying to have that philosophy of getting folks into housing, really letting them drive with the supports they need in place, and helping them identify housing and working with partners. I apologize, my computer just went out, but that's our hope within this project. That was our core components, and they all launched, I guess I didn't say this, they all launched in May of 2017, and then the projects will end December of this year, 2018. But our hope is that all of them will continue to use VOCA funds for this project, and that more programs around the state will use VOCA or other funding to try similar models and take what we've learned and apply it. All right, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so just quickly, and I'll let Lindsay and Claudia talk more about this, but just across the project sites, some of the exciting things we're seeing, and this is just pulling some raw data, so I still need to go through and do more analyzing, and we'll have more reports as we get closer to the end of the project. But among the 8 sites, and these are from May 1st of 2017 to December 31st of 2017, of those who accessed the housing program, on average about 85% are accessing long-term housing. Of course, this is within a shorter time frame, so some of them may fall back out of that housing and need to get housed again. 187 survivors have received rental assistance across the 8 sites from May to December of last year. Advocates in these 8 sites have engaged 96 landlords, which I think is awesome. It doesn't mean that all of those landlords necessarily signed a contract, but that they are working to educate landlords and to try to get them to work with survivors and work with their agency. And 325 survivors were served through mobile advocacy through that May 1st to December. So I think we're definitely seeing a high need, and Jen and I were just talking about this before the webinar of, the need is so high across the state. So the more of us that can be supporting these efforts, hopefully the more people we're catching before they fall through the cracks. All right, next slide, we'll talk about some challenges, because there always is, but maybe I should say opportunities. And this is just some summarizing across the sites. We hear some, difficulties with survivors who may be undocumented or even have English as a second language. Just some barriers of, landlords maybe fear of renting to someone because they fear that they might get in trouble. So there may be some more education that advocates are doing in that realm. Also, just a survivor themselves, sometimes landlords are hesitant. They fear what, quote unquote, trouble someone might bring. So that's also an education opportunity to talk about, survivors aren't necessarily any more of a risk than any other tenant, right? And that domestic violence is happening in all types of communities and probably is already happening in their units. And the survivors that are working with the program have extra support because they have the support of the advocate and of the program. Also, I talked about sort of that low barrier approach, and a challenge has been sort of how do we, follow this low barrier philosophy, but also, we have to have some program sustainability, right? We only have so much funding. And that's been a challenge. I think we've all learned, we didn't quite know how to estimate what the budget should look like because most of us hadn't done this before in this way. And so most of the sites have quickly spent their money and our amazing team at DCJ is working with them to figure out how do we, maybe increase that so that we don't run out of funding since we have till December. So that's a challenge. Obviously, a lack of affordable housing in general is an issue across the state, and even just, lack of housing, period. And in some of our, resort communities, it's the lack of seasonal housing, even for hotels, right? That if we can get a survivor in a hotel for a week or two until they can get into an apartment, sometimes that's an option, but in some communities, that's really difficult. And of course, we're using federal funds, so there's limitations to grant funding. So we can't pay for security deposits, which has, I'm so amazed by the creativity of the advocates in terms of, maybe working with the landlord, and sometimes the landlord will allow the survivor to make a security deposit payment over a period of months. Sometimes that works, or sometimes maybe it's other community partners that can pay for that. We can't pay for car repair, which is a really big challenge, especially in rural areas, as you know. Getting to and from work may be the only thing that's keeping them housed, and so that can be a challenge. We also can't pay debt or mortgage, just as a couple of other, examples. And so it's important to also look at how do you sort of braid other funding in with this type of approach to try to keep it flexible, but also having that staff expert in housing that's really building their relationships has been really key for this project, because they're the ones who may more quickly know someone to reach out to, may know about some of these resources, but also know the housing lingo and have the relationships with landlords and others to help fill some of these gaps. So we're always learning and hoping to share back what we're learning with all of you and people in the state so that we can learn from this and hopefully improve and help to meet some of the needs of survivors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Stevie. So again, my name is Lindsay Christopher, and I work for Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, and we're located in Boulder County. Jen, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So I thought I'd start with a general overview of how we're using these funds. And we have several different housing programs, and the name for the VOCA funds that we're using, we are calling this the Housing Stability for Survivors Project. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, and it takes a little while to remember the name, but if you just think rental assistance, you're on the right track. So the goals of this program include increasing survivors' access to long-term permanent housing, and this is through case management and or financial assistance. Increasing community awareness of domestic violence and how that impacts someone's housing needs. And this can be a combination of things. Oftentimes it's how the domestic violence impacts someone's housing or lack of. So housing stability, the importance of stable housing for DV survivors, as well as some of the legal protections. And then also around the impact of DV, like common barriers to housing, criminal background, credit, eviction, and lack of rental references. So that's a little bit of the work that I've been doing with community partners and local landlords. I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of the landlord outreach, and then the mobile advocates and direct client advocates do most of the direct client work. I will step in if folks are having a hard time with a particular landlord. There have been a few times where we have used the legal protections that passed last year to support a survivor in breaking their lease. And since it is pretty new, not all landlords are aware of that protection. So sometimes I step in and facilitate that. And also some of our clients that are trying to do emergency transfers, Just given I've been with the agency since 2011, so given some of the experience in the housing realm and relationships that I have, sometimes for those harder, difficult cases, I take those on or do a little bit of extra support for folks doing the direct client work. Jen, if you want to go ahead and move forward. So a little bit more about the project specifics. In terms of staffing, our housing team is a team of 5 folks. We have our economic justice and housing director. I am the coordinator, the Housing Stability for Survivors project coordinator. And then for this particular program, we have the Housing Stability for Survivors project mobile advocate. So we do have 2 other folks on the housing team that do direct client services, but for the most part, our Housing Stability for Survivors project mobile advocate is bilingual, so she's doing most of the work with folks that are receiving assistance through this funding. The categories of financial assistance that we've been helping folks with include rental assistance, utility assistance, and relocation assistance. And the approach is short-term, light touch, and client-driven. And we use a mobile advocacy model. So our mobile advocate is able to meet folks wherever they feel most comfortable. If that's in their home, if that's at a coffee shop, or in our office, we try and make ourselves as flexible as possible. We do take safety in consideration. So if a client says that their abuser is still in the home, when we first start working with them, we're not going to be doing home visits. Or if their abuser is at large, that's another instance in which we wouldn't necessarily do a home visit. But our Housing Stability for Survivors project mobile advocate will do a housing assessment with them. That's kind of their first interaction with a client. They complete a housing assessment, which is pretty much just gathering basic information. We get some demographic information, and what we're really looking for are ties to the community, income, expenses, what resources or support systems they already have in place, and really we want to hear from the client what their goals are. So again, the purpose of this program is to increase access to long-term housing, so we want to support folks in what their housing needs are. Once they do a SPAN housing assessment, we staff those as a team and try and figure out what resources or programs that we have relationships or access to might be the best fit for them. Really, someone's only accessing HSSP funds if they're pretty close to self-sufficiency, and that's because it is a short-term, light-touch model. So we want to see that folks are going to be successful after we step in. We might help with half of their rent for a month. We might help with full rent for a month. There have even been times where we've helped folks for a couple months in a row with some smaller portions of their rent. So we really do try and make sure that the survivor feels supported in whatever way feels best to them. Let's see. I think the only other piece that I would add in the approach is just that if folks are able to demonstrate that they're able to be self-sufficient within a pretty quick time frame, these funds are pretty flexible, so we're able to support them very quickly. Jen, if you want to go ahead and move forward. So just some numbers to go along with some of what we've been doing. These numbers are up to date. Let's see, these are up through January 1st of 2018. We are actually getting ready to analyze our data for the first quarter of 2018 here in about a week or so. So these numbers are a little bit old. I apologize, I didn't have time to refresh those. But let's see, from May to December of 2017, we served 101 households with financial assistance and/or case management. Let's see. We were also noticing some gaps in funding that some of them we expected and some of them we weren't anticipating. Some of those gaps include deposits, application fees, eviction prevention, transportation. Those are just a couple of the things that Stevie had mentioned earlier as well. Obviously, different grants have different requirements and restrictions, so those were just the most prominent that we were facing. We actually weren't expecting deposits or eviction prevention to be a barrier. In Boulder County, we have access to the Boulder County Housing Panel, and that is a resource for folks to get assistance with deposit, eviction prevention, and arrears. But that resource was actually on hold for a lot of 2017. So we saw a huge need for deposits and eviction prevention that we weren't able to meet. There were instances where clients were able to pay a really high deposit, and then we would step in and pay a full month's rent. But those were instances in which we were paying, pretty much matching what the client was contributing to their move-in expenses. And partnerships that have been helpful. We have been doing transitional housing work since about the 1980s, so we are really lucky in that we have a lot of partnerships that existed prior to this grant funding, and we've had a lot of experience doing different kinds of transitional housing, so that's been really helpful in trying to keep this program running effectively. And some of those relationships have been with local housing authorities. There's actually 3 in Boulder County, not to make things super confusing. Housing and Human Services, and then family resource centers tend to have access to some funds that can be used for rental assistance or deposit assistance, as well as some of their own internal housing programs. So that's been another piece of my position as the housing coordinator, is working in more depth with our community partners to build accurate referral processes and really work together with one another. And some of our keys to success, I had mentioned flexible funding a moment ago, and working and engaging with low-income tax credit properties has been really helpful. For our clients, typically they're low to middle income, if they have income at all. So working with low-income tax credit properties has been helpful because they only ask that clients prove that they earn 2 times the rent, versus a lot of places that are asking someone to show that they earn 3 times 1 month's rent. So low-income tax credit properties have really been where I've started with my landlord engagement. Rental rates are really high, so trying to support a client and proving that they earn 2 times the rent is a lot easier than 3 times the rent in this rental market in Boulder. Jen, if you want to go ahead and move forward. And then we thought we would include just a couple of success stories so that you get an idea of how these funds are being used and the impact that they're having. So I'm going to go ahead and just read these to you. Sam was living in her own apartment when she reached out to the SPAN counseling team. She explained that the recent DV incident took place over the weekend and shared that her abuser was ultimately arrested and stole rent money from a secure rent drop box. Sam called various community partners for help, but in her community, there is a lack of resources, especially regarding housing assistance. Another barrier that she encountered was her income. The places that may have been able to support this scenario stated that her income was too high. This left her unable to pay her rent, and she was concerned that she was going to be evicted from her home due to her abuser's actions. When Sam reached out to the counseling team, her rent was already close to being late, so an immediate referral to the housing team was made. The housing team was able to work with the survivor to get her rent paid on time and avoid any late fees or threat of eviction. Without flexible funding through the HSSP program, we may not have been able to support Sam during this hard time. She was able to access funds without income requirements. We were able to pay her rent in a timely manner and provide resources to a geographic area that has some gaps in funding. For timing purposes, I'm not going to go ahead and read the other, I think there's 2 more on the PowerPoint, but feel free to read through those. There are some really impactful stories, and it really does give you an idea of how this funding is being used to have a real immediate impact on people's lives. So when you get a chance, maybe read Jessica and Maria, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me.
Hello, everyone. This is Claudia from Bright Future Foundation. If Jen, we could go to the next slide, please. We are the only domestic violence sexual assault agency in Eagle County. We very rural community, but we're a resort community, so we're very, very expensive, and we have very low affordability, which means we also have a very low inventory of affordable housing. We also have the only shelter in the county. And like I mentioned at the introduction, we have also a grant through the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, where we help 5 to 6 families with leasing for a year with subsidies and supportive services. So that's our rapid rehousing program. Now, because we are the only agency in the county, we try to be as comprehensive as possible when it comes to dealing with victims and survivors of domestic violence. So we focus not only on the survivor, but we also do a lot of wraparound services as far as the family is concerned. So we have a buddy mentors program, and we have some programs in the schools where we talk about bullying. Um, and, so we're reaching kids in middle school and high school level as well. So hopefully we can end the cycle of violence. And we provide um, a lot of culturally sensitive programs and a lot of emotional behavioral support to these families. So we have a large Hispanic population, and both of our advocates on staff are bilingual. I am bilingual myself, so that way we can meet the clients. They feel more comfortable talking directly to us. We have found that this program has become a lot of eviction prevention for us because we don't have a whole lot of housing options. We want to keep survivors that have a place to live where they are. Because unfortunately, our low income tax credit properties sometimes can have a wait list of 5 to 12 months. And we have noticed that our shelters numbers have decreased. So in a way that's great, because for people that do really need the shelter, we can have it available to them a lot more. And it's the same thing. We're trying to get the clients to stay in their home if they can, if the perpetrator had been removed. We'd rather help them where they are at instead of uprooting the whole family and taking them to a shelter. If I could get the next slide, please. So the goals of our program, which is called Ensuring Freedom, is to increase survivors' access to long-term and permanent housing. Like Stevie was mentioning, because we're a resort community, we have a lot of seasonal housing. And so we always try to find places where the survivors can stay longer term outside of, like, for example, workforce housing or anything like that. We want to expand community support. So I will go to county commissioner meetings. I will go to workforce housing meetings. I'll go to realtor meetings, so that people know who we are, what we're doing about this new program. And once people are aware of the program, they're aware that we do have survivors in this area. Then it's finding that safety and stability for them. And the last one is providing survivor-driven, low-barrier mobile advocacy for crime victims. Very similar to what Lindsay said, we want to meet the survivors where they're at. I have found, and I'm sure Lindsay has too, that the success of the program really depends on what the survivor wants and being there for them as much or as little as they want us to be there for them. Next slide, please. So the way that we work the housing program is that I am the housing manager, and I work with the two advocates as much as possible. Because a lot of times the advocates will provide wraparound services, but if the advocates don't know what our housing or budget goals are, then there's a gap in communication. So we work together so that the advocate knows what the client's goals are as far as housing and budget, and then that way they can move them towards that goal, because the advocates meet with them a whole lot more than I do. So I have a weekly meeting with our executive director and our sustainability director, where we go over like procedural, if like a new client came in, how can we help them? What is the best approach? And then so those meetings are on Tuesdays. And then the next meeting that we have is with the supervision team. Now the supervision team that we have, they meet on Thursdays, and we oversee the implementation of the program itself with the two advocates. The way that it works on Thursdays. The advocates go through all of their clients, and we have the supervision team is composed of our clinical director, who looks at mental health, any mental health issues, our staff attorney, who looks at any legal issues, our sustainability director, who looks at any health and human services issues, and then myself, the housing manager. I look at not just housing, because nobody lives in a vacuum. I look at financial needs, debt assessment, how can the housing program help them? So once somebody is approved for housing, then at that point I meet with them and we start looking at a budget, we look at debts, and we start setting some goals so that the money that we're providing in this rental assistance is also going to give them financial independence and stability. Because ultimately that's what we want. We want people to be sustainable on their own for a long time, long term, hopefully permanently. If I could get the next slide, please. So because we're a smaller program, I felt like it was more effective for me to talk to you about our successes as far as how our clients have responded to the program. So our clients report feeling safer. They report understanding their environment a lot more and not feeling so like claustrophobic. They feel like they can be more proactive about their safety. They also report that they have a better perspective on recognizing signs of domestic violence. This is really important to us because we have a lot of different cultures here, and a lot of them, our clients, have been taught that if their domestic violence is not physical, then it's not domestic violence. And so we talk to them and educate them a lot about emotional abuse and psychological abuse and financial abuse. So they now recognize it more, and I think that's a great success. They also report having more time with family and rebuilding trust. I think it's also important to note when you're dealing with domestic violence, especially if a parent brings a significant other into the house that ends up being a perpetrator. We have noticed that kids as young as 10, 11, up until their teenage years, they have a break in trust in the parent that brought in the significant other. And so we talk a lot about rebuilding trust and family, and focusing on family interrelationships. And then they also report having a sense of economic independence. As far as landlord engagement goes, we've had some really good successes in that landlords are very quick to remove perpetrators from the lease in order for us to move forward and be able to provide assistance. Landlords are quick about changing locks, a lot of times within 24 hours of our request, sometimes even quicker. And something that we didn't expect, but that we're very glad to do, is that landlords are referring clients to us. Now, the way that our programs work is that the clients have to come initially on their own. So a lot of times landlords will call us and, just say, let us know that the client's there. Of course, we always say that the client has to come voluntarily at first. So, nobody's going to be made to come to see us. But it does give us a lot of reputation when a landlord is like, you need to go see these people. And it also, the landlords are being very flexible with their clients when it comes to paying rent late or anything like that, because they understand, and we've educated them about the situation of being a survivor, and sometimes survivors that are going through trauma being in survival mode, and maybe the rent isn't a priority for them. And so we've had landlords give us as much as 30 days without even initiating any kind of eviction process. If we could go to the next slide, please. Hello?
This one?
Yeah, no, the next one. Oh, there we are. So I just want to give a quick, I've got some success stories. I've got two, but I'm only going to talk about one. It's our client PR, and she has 3 children, 2 with the perpetrator and 1 older child. She was 18 at the time. She was a victim of domestic violence from the father of the 2 younger children. But unbeknownst to her, he was also sexually assaulting her older daughter. So she filed charges, and he left the area, but they were still living in that same 2-bedroom apartment where the victimization occurred. And so there wasn't any way for them to move to a different apartment. Like some apartment complexes that have like different setups, but this particular apartment complex, all the 2 bedrooms were the same. But she wanted to start over, and she could feel like psychologically they weren't going to be able to do that without moving out of that apartment. So what we did is we helped cover the rent for them for 3 months, and during this time she was able to save up to close to $4,000. And we also worked with the landlord to try to get her into a 3-bedroom apartment. Because there was a very long wait list, but the landlord was very cognizant of this client's particular needs. And so she was able to move into a 3-bedroom apartment right at the end of the time that we were helping her. Her oldest daughter, seeing all this effort, started voluntarily going to therapy. She got a therapy dog. She got a job because before she didn't even leave the house, where she's already received at least 1 promotion. And her daughter also started contributing to the rent. And, you know, even though they weren't able to physically leave town, by going to a different type of apartment, a 3-bedroom with a different setup, they felt like they were able to start over and not only feel safer, but also emotionally and psychologically more stable. And that is all I have.
Ladies, I think we can go to maybe one more slide over. This is Stevie again. I did just want to mention, we're going to go into some tips. And I'll let Lindsay and Claudia talk about this, and also just keeping in mind as we discuss this, sorry, Jen, we have one more slide. Perfect. That, you know, I'm available for an ongoing resource, so are Lindsay and Claudia and our other projects, because our hope is that we'll be able to support other programs in doing similar approaches, because we know the need is so high that if survivors can stay housed or get rehoused, they may be safer and more stable. And, you know, the last Crime Victim Services application was just recently due, but Jen did attach a short document we put together with just some tips about using VOCA funding specifically for this type of approach. But I'm happy to share any other information with you if this is something you're interested in or something like this. We're all here to help. It's all helpful not to have to reinvent the wheel and just use some of what we've learned and what we know works and doesn't work. But Lindsay, I think maybe this was your slide, or Claudia, if you wanted to talk a little bit about some tips.
Yeah, Lindsay, if you want to go ahead and start.
Go ahead.
And I'll just jump in
sure.
whenever.
Sure. So I think this is what Claudia and I did last time that we presented this webinar as well. So I'll just kind of start with what we had to kind of start from scratch with. So in terms of screening and assessment, how we screen for the program and who, if anyone, is your target population. So I had mentioned that we screen folks by doing a housing assessment at intake with all of our new clients. And actually, I shouldn't just say new clients, we do it with all of our clients. So even if they're already in another branch of our services, we still do a housing assessment to gather that basic information for anybody. And then in terms of target population, some of our grants, not this one in particular, but other programs have target populations that we are prioritizing, like elders that don't quite meet the senior housing requirements, LGBT clients, undocumented folks, so folks that are more marginalized and have fewer options. Think about what mobile advocacy will look like for your agency. Because of the housing programs that we've had access to over the last couple of years, we actually have been doing mobile advocacy for quite a while and just not calling it that. We've been doing appointments. One of our requirements for our rapid rehousing resource is that we do in-home visits with clients to get a more accurate picture of what their day-to-day looks like and how they're doing. And also in terms of miles driven per month, this isn't so much an issue for us. We primarily work in Boulder County, but I know that our mobile advocate for this position does do some work with counties that are close by. I would say within maybe a 10 to 30 minute drive. And if we have clients in the Denver area, we have been supporting them by meeting with them prior to their move. So we've had clients in our services here in Boulder that relocated for safety or cost of living. And since we've already had that contact with them, we helped even though we weren't able to meet with them in Denver. So they would come and meet us halfway, either in Broomfield, or we would just complete the intake over the phone or the request over the phone. Community partnerships, which we spoke to a little bit earlier, housing authorities, family resource centers, other DV agencies, low-income tax credit properties, looking into what housing programs already exist and try to do an inventory. I know that that can be really hard sometimes because you get information and then the next day that it changes, or the person who was your contact at that resource leaves, and you just try not to recreate the wheel. We had a family resource center who was receiving funds and staffing to actually be able to do just this, is create an inventory of what exists and present it to the community, and that was really helpful. Workforce housing, benefits and limitations of those. Housing Colorado and Continuum of Care, join them. If you have the opportunity, I mentioned that in Boulder County, we have access to the Housing Resource Panel. That's our local COC, and there's multiple resources through Housing and Human Services. It is a coordinated entry approach in that everybody goes through the same application process, the screening, the housing panel, and then the panel determines what resource might be the best fit for that family. And then get to know housing in your local area. What are common rental rates in your area? Are vacancies pretty hard to come by? I know when I first started this position, we were at a negative vacancy rate in Boulder County because of the floods. And it's not uncommon to see a one-bedroom renting for between $1,000 and $1,400. What would 3 or 6 months of rent look like for those rental rates? And then what are the opportunities for families, for single individuals? I think historically, in my experience, there's more resources for families than there are single individuals. So that's kind of where that piece comes from. And then Claudia, if there's anything else that you want to add, go ahead and jump into any and all sections.
Yeah, so I was going to just go back to screening assessment and assessments, who, if anyone, is your target population. I think a lot of times we have a perception that most of our clients are going to be low income, folks, and we have learned as we go through this that we're not just working with folks that are living within the fair market value, but we also have folks that are living at the market value. So just to give you a small example of what the fair market value is here, is for us a 2-bedroom is $1,456, but the market value can go as high as $2,100 just for a 1-bedroom. So if you're trying to do a new program, keep in mind that sometimes you may have to go above the fair market value or some, leverage to try to make it work for clients that live in more expensive situations. As far as the miles driven per month, I think this was a big shocker for us when we did our initial grant application. Because I do a large part of the mobile advocacy in this program, there are months that I can drive up to 600 miles in 1 month. Slow months, I probably drive about 300 miles, but that's a lot of mileage reimbursement when it comes to funding for the particular program. As far as community partners, I agree with Lindsay. You got to know who's out there. But because we're such a small county, and we're pretty much, when it comes to housing, we're one of the only ones in here. So what we do is we're actually looking more at who are our partners, or that can help us not only in growing our housing market, but also in helping our clients. So we work with Vail Resorts, is a huge employer here, so we try to work with them, especially when they have vacancies in the summer. That helps us at least, temporarily house clients. The other thing we also work with is realtors. They have a internal listserv here where realtors will talk about available units, and so sometimes we can get a realtor to put our client's need, without disclosing their identification, of course, on the listserv to see if there's any available housing, not just through the regular property management, large complexes, but maybe some private housing, lots of lock-offs or, anything like that. Like I mentioned before, I try to go to the local county commissioners meetings whenever they have any kind of meetings that are surrounded concerning housing. And then getting to know your housing area. Like I mentioned, for us, the regular property large complexes have a 5 to 12-month wait list. So that makes us get more creative about who we're talking to regarding housing and working with local and private landlords. And as far as how much rent you're going to give, for us, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be gradual, where you give like 2 months full rent, 2 months half rent, maybe 2 months a quarter rent. So we have found that having a gradual decrease of rent is a lot more effective than just giving them 3 months and then like it's a cliff for them. And then as far as families versus singles, I agree with Lindsay that we have found that families have more resources. So that means that if you're planning to do a program, you're probably going to need more money for your single clients. And then the other thing we do that we have found a lot of successes in is knowing other resources of funding that may be able to supplement your program. So we are able to supplement our program with like the COVA emergency funds or victims compensation within our local judicial district. We've also, as far as deposits go, we'll go to like the Salvation Army or some other local agencies. So then that way we can still help the clients and still help them with the type of funding that we're not usually able to provide. Okay.
All right. So now I think we just have some time for questions. If folks have any specific questions or additional information that we can provide for you that would be helpful.
I'm not seeing any questions, but if anybody does have any, go ahead and type those in the chat box now, and we'd be happy to take some time to answer them.
Yeah, and we do have our contact info as well. So if you need some time to think about it, I think any of us and all of us are happy to talk to you offline as well. And we have our contact information at the end of the presentation, and then you have a copy of the PowerPoint as well with our information on there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions here at the moment, so thank you, Claudia and Lindsay and Stevie, for joining us today. I think that was really helpful information. I know COVA sees a lot of requests come in for rental assistance, so it's really good to know what other resources are out there and what other programs are doing to help and meet those needs. And I think that we'll continue to see lots of great work in this area because it seems like this is still a pretty young program and it's just getting started.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us, and thanks for everyone who jumped on the webinar today.
Yes, thank you, Jen.
Yeah, you're welcome. And everyone who's on today, you will get a follow-up email in a few days with a link to this recording if you want to share it. We'll also have the handouts included in that. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the presenters today, and we will do what we can to help you. So thank you all again to our presenters and to everyone who joined us today.